What is up, everybody? I'm Grandmaster Ron Hambleton, and I'm excited to be here, and I'm going to be doing a recap today. We just had Game 1 of the World Chess Championship, probably the most anticipated World Championship for chess fans around the world. There's a lot of new chess fans, a lot of people getting into chess for the first time, so I think that this match is just going to be the most widely viewed of any World Championship match in recent memory. So really exciting stuff. We just had game one today. Let's get into it straight from the top. So first of all, we had Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces. They had the drawing of lots for the World Championship. Jan got white, and he decides to open up with e4, which I think many people could have expected. There was a little fun banter going around how Magnus has a poor score against 1d4 in the World Championship, but I don't think that factors into either of these players as they do their match prep. So e5 from the world champion, and very quickly we see the opening develop into a Ruy Lopez, which again, very standard stuff at this top level of play. Both players have been here many times before. A6, bishop a4, and you also have to keep in mind this is only game one of the world championship. It's a 14-game match. Obviously, neither player wants to lose game one, so there probably is an element of safety that I think both players are generally going to be using, and there's also that fear of making a mistake. So players are playing more timid, and they're probably a little bit nervous as well. I mean, this is the biggest match of both of their careers, especially for Jan, who's playing his first World Championship match. Okay, we see a6, knight f6, so no Berlin. We just see one of the main lines of the Ruy Lopez. And I'm going to take us forward to this moment right here where we see the move b5. And b5 committed this early, is very standard in the Ruy Lopez. This is how all of the Ruy Lopez's start. After bishop b3, black has the option of d6 or castling. And it really depends on how the players want to handle what we call the Marshall Gambit. So after bishop b3 castles, we see Jan decide to play h3. Now, pretty standard is the move c3. You guys may have seen this move before, and the idea is simply to play d4, one of the most standard moves. Now, black can reply d6. Logical. I mean, move d6 makes a lot of sense, but it also allows white to get this, big center with d4 if he wants to, or just play h3 now and then play d4 in the future, and we get into some topical lines. But it's sort of fallen out of fashion at the top level, because with the top level guys, these 2800s want to do is they want to find a really forced continuation that trades off a lot of pieces or that equalizes in a more dynamic way. And that's what's become fashionable lately. So after c3, the move d5 has, surged in popularity at the top level. And something like this is, the purest form of what we call the Marshall Gambit. And it used to be a very fun back and forth gambit where black gets a lot of attacking chances on the king side with the queen coming out to h4, etc. But lately, and I say this with a heavy heart, unfortunately, the engines have done such good work that the opening pretty much reaches a draw almost every time that it's played. And it's become such a good weapon for black to use for that reason. It's tough to win this with white. It does happen from time to time, and black gets some wins as well, but in general, the best moves have shown to equalize at the highest level. So for that reason, this move d5 is kind of a move that white wants to avoid, and that's why in the actual game, white played the move h3. So this is Jan's move against the move d5, the move h3 being more useful than the move c3 if black decided to still go d5. So this is called what we've referred to as an anti-Marshall. It basically says, nope, I don't want you playing that move. It's not going to happen. Let's just play a normal game. And Magnus came up with this move, knight a5. And I was looking in the database, guys. It's not a novelty. It's been played before, but it's as close to a novelty as you can get. I found a game with 2500 that was played in 1998, so quite a while ago. That's more than 20 years ago. And then on top of that, there's been some other games slightly more recently that are correspondence. And there's this I guess this old saying, always follow the correspondence. These guys know the absolute best moves. There's tons of correspondence games out there in the database that usually end in a draw. Correspondence chess being chess that you play where you can actually use an engine to assist your moves. And this move was played in a lot of those games that all resulted in a draw. So Magnus is giving up the e5 pawn, which he does, and he's getting a position that might look a little bit like the Marshall positions that I was just showing you guys. But obviously there's a big difference. You're down a full pawn, and white has done an anti-Marshall. So black's trying to play the Marshall. White says no, anti-Marshall. And black says, no, I'm going to play knight a5 and basically get a Marshall-looking position anyway. So right off the bat, I knew this was going to be a fun game. Magnus comes with knight a5, which is close to a novelty already. Certainly hasn't been seen in top-level play from what I can see in the database. And pretty quickly we see Magnus developing, bishop b7, hitting the center, and after white defends it, we see d5. Striking at the center, pretty much forcing white to capture this, and after queen d5, we get a similar feeling to the Marshall Gambit where black is down a pawn. There's no debating that. But he's got the two bishops, and great diagonal, and white's pieces, as you can see, lack a lot of development. So after queen takes d5, white plays a move which is fairly normal, queen f3. He wants a queen trade. So he's saying, look, I don't care about the potential double pawns here, double isolated pawns, because I'm up a pawn. I have an extra pawn on d3. So if you want to trade more pieces like that, be my guest. It also gets rid of black's two bishop advantage. So after queen f3, bishop d6 was played. And at the moment, I think both players were playing relatively quickly from what I could see while I was watching the match. Bishop d6 still looks like Magnus's prep. And then the move king f1 from Jan is by chess.com, new tool game review. This is actually a double exclamation mark. Brilliant move by Nepo. So first brilliant move goes to him in the World Championship. It's tricky because in this position after bishop d6, if white plays a normal looking move, knight c3, saying, hey, take me, right? I want to force the simplification. If the queen moves away, the bishop hangs on b7. Well, not so fast. Queen takes e5, brilliant move. If rook takes, then you grab on f3, and the rook's hanging, and black is up a piece currently. And after queen e5, if you take on b7, worst move you could play. Queen takes e1, and it's even a checkmate because the bishop's covering the escape square. So it's not that easy in this position to play a normal-looking move because a lot of them are blundering. Queen e5 is a big threat. So king f1 is a great move because the queens are going to be exchanged here. The bishop is not protected. So if the queen tries to move away and say, hey, your king's on f1, this bishop's hanging, it doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. So the bishop's just loose here. If queen takes e5 anyway, which I was thinking when I watched the game, getting to h2, the one thing that I think is important to remember is that this queen covers the pawn. So if you give a check here, the king just runs to e2, there's nothing happening. The bishop blocks on e3 if there's a check. Meanwhile, the queen's attacked. And if you don't give that check, and you try to bring the rook over, well, I just don't see how black's getting the attack. The queen covers everything. The knight has no squares to get involved. I think white's doing great here. So rook to b8, surprising looking move, but it defends the bishop. So you guys can see maybe black has an idea to move the queen now, attacking white's queen. White says, okay, time to get that off the board. And I'll just skip forward a few moves here. Bishop d2, covering where black might want to move this knight. c5, and white's just sort of regrouping at the moment, finally getting developed. Black's gaining some space, still has the two bishops and some great diagonals, and he's finally bringing the rooks back out of the entombed queen side. So knight b4, this is another important moment, hitting the c2 pawn. You might ask yourself, like, which side you would prefer here. Of course, the engine leans towards white. We've got that extra pawn, clear. But in black's position, we've got these great two bishops I keep talking about. Pressure on this knight, so you're always ready to double the pawns in the right moment. And this knight on b4 attacks the c2 pawn. If white ever plays c3, then the d3 pawn is loose. And white can't really play d4 easily because it's just going to open the position for black's bishops. After white defends the pawn, you're kind of looking at the position and maybe saying like, okay, I like white, we're up a pawn, but what do we do next? And for black, it's easy to understand that maybe you want to gain some space on the king side. Maybe we can still improve our rooks. I don't need this rook here guarding this a-pawn with the knight and bishop there. So black seems to have moves that can improve, and white really needs a plan. So knight e2, maybe the idea of bishop takes knight. Magnus didn't like that, brought the knight back immediately. And after bishop e3, knight e7, looking to reroute, we actually saw, I think, a pretty important moment in the match where bishop f4 was played after a think from Jan. Bishop f4, and this immediately clarified the position. Magnus had to think as well and decided, well, if bishop f4 is being played, then now's the time to make some decisive choices. Bishop takes f3, and there's bishop takes e2 check, so you don't want to play this, for example. Losing a piece. He's got to take back. Magnus continues to exchange and play rook c6. This guards the pawn, right, from this rook on a1, and it also plans to swing the rook maybe to some important squares, f6, h6, attacking those weak pawns in white's position. Because of these double isolated pawns and a weak pawn on h3, I think the position is relatively balanced right now, and maybe the engine even starts to prefer black. So rook e1, knight f5, and now we start to see, I think it's more like a Magnus position, if I can call it that. Turn that into an adjective. This is a Magnus position if I've ever seen one. There's pawn weaknesses. Black is still down a pawn, do not forget, but look how immobile those pawns are. Again, d4, b4, c3, none of these moves look very good. c3, of course, I think might have to be played, but it also creates a weakness on d3. So as soon as you play this move c3, you've got this d3 pawn you got to worry about for the whole game. So that's really where the compensation comes from. Black's got a great pawn structure over here. I think the fact that white's up a pawn compensates for all those positional defects. So c3, as I mentioned, not letting that knight get into a beautiful, beautiful d4 square. Knight h4 attacking a pawn. And I think here there were some interesting moments because Magnus played king f8. I mean, it's a great move, brings the king to the center, no back rank issues, stops rook e7. But an interesting move would have been g6. And I wonder how deeply Magnus considered the move g6. Rook f6, which hits the knight and the pawn, sort of falls, let's say, quote unquote, falls into knight d5. You can't take because of mate, and that's where you get punished for not having an escape square. And if rook takes f3, rook takes a6, and all of a sudden white is the one who's starting to attack. Don't really like this position for Magnus anymore. So g6 gives an escape square and has the threat rook f6 hitting the knight and hitting the pawn. So I thought g6 did have a lot of merit to it. King f8, very similar idea though. The only thing is after knight g2, knight f5, rook e5. And I think after rook e5, everyone was really expecting that when Magnus protected his knight, Jan would play king e2. And was really surprised not to see this move. Jan played knight e1, guarding some pawn weaknesses, but really putting the knight out of play. Super Grandmasters are really good at this. So what I mean is that if f6 happens, rook e4, you might see something to the effect of rook here, knight there, and, some draw like this. I mean, these super GMs, they're super GMs at chess and at finding repetitions in the middle of nowhere. Like it's their job to sometimes. Did not happen. And instead the move knight e1 was played by Nepo. I find this move to be a little bit passive during the game. I didn't like this move very much. I thought king e2 was a bit better. But knight e1 protects the pawn, and white has a plan here. King e2, king d2, king c2. And there the king is going to be protecting all the weaknesses, and then maybe white can start to regroup. Speaking of regrouping, that's exactly what this position calls for. Black's rook is defending the two weak pawns in his position, c5 and a6 that white's attacking. So he's got one rook defending two things at once, which might call overworked, but here it's actually great, works out. Knight here looking to reroute to e6. And Magnus is just slowly improving his position with f5, but so is Nepo. The king is coming, and Magnus realizes this. So after knight g2 to once again prevent the knight from coming into f4, Magnus goes for the move b4. This is probably the last really critical moment because Nepo has a decision. Do you want to take here? Well, no. You don't want to give up control of that square and allow the rook into to c2. Similarly, the move c4 doesn't look that great either, giving up control. So if you're going to leave the position as it is, king e2 makes the most sense. But then we see the follow-up, rook b8. Now this pawn is going to be loose. And I mean, white playing the move rook b1 just to get ready for that, it's not the most convincing thing ever. Plus, black can always double the rooks. This knight on g2 is no match for its counterpart on e6, so I still think that black has enough compensation, more than enough compensation for the pawn. Rook takes b3. Nepo decides, hey, I'm going to sacrifice my pawn back just to stabilize my position and give my pieces some squares. And I think that is the mark of a very accomplished player and a player with very good practical instincts. He doesn't want to suffer in a position that's slightly worse for him, but up a pawn. He'd rather give that pawn back and reach some sort of parity. And that's pretty much what happens here. h4 stops knight g5, which hits both pawns. So now Nepo's rook is free to move around. Magnus starts improving his king. And finally, that knight, which has been so bad sitting on the g2 square for a while and just been on e1. I mean, it's been terrible the whole game compared to black's knight. Look what's happening. It finally reaches an amazing c4 square. And then knight e5. I mean, just look at the journey, guys. It's an impressive recovery. The knight finally reaches a great position. And what we see here is rather interesting. Knight e5. And we see repetition, right? Now, repetition, fully expected to some people. And for me, I think I was expecting a draw. But psychologically, I think Nepo's position right now is the best that it's been all game. He really has come out of the wilderness, so to speak, from earlier. He's made it out of the weeds of a tough position. He doesn't have an extra pawn anymore, but he has pressure against a6. Rook a5 threatens both pawns at once. It's tough for black to move as well. And I thought maybe he would continue to play here, but this is once again, sort of the Magnus effect. He has you on your back foot a little bit and suddenly makes you second guess whenever you might have an advantage. So in the end, a draw is a fair result. It was agreed here, draw by repetition. So game 1 of the World Chess Championship does end in a draw. I think Magnus is obviously going to be pretty satisfied. He has the black pieces. He even had chances maybe to push for more. And it's game 1, so he starts over the draw. He's going to have the white pieces next. Nepo stabilizes game 1, and he's looking forward to a match where he's clearly shown he can hang with Magnus. But I think Nepo needs to look for more dynamic positions going forward. So an exciting game 1. We saw Magnus bring out this move knight a5 in the opening that I think is absolutely key in terms of his preparation and how Nepo's going to handle this move maybe in the future. And looking forward to the next game, guys. We'll see you for the game 2 recap where Magnus gets the white pieces.